The Cold War. It was really cold. Welcome to this absurdly and crazy presentation about how Tetris ended the Cold War. My name is Wentzel and my fellow peers here with me today is Luca and Nico. And we're not here today to talk about the boring events and historical significances that occurred post-World War II, but rather, let's discuss something we all love doing and will always prefer to do over homework and studying. Sports and movies have always been one of the best ways for audiences of all maturity levels to spend their free time. Or how often would you watch one of your favorite sports teams crush someone else? How about any gamers out there? Your parents still telling you that video games are bad for you and have no relevance to real life? Well, what if I told you that back in the Cold War, even the soldiers played video games to practice their hand-eye coordination? Now, let's dig deep and find out how the Cold War really affected the entertainment industry.
Basically, the Cold War was this conflict between this dude who wanted people and companies to control big industries versus this other dude, with a mustache this time, that wanted the government to control everything. More information? That's ridiculous.
Where's your script?
What are you saying? My script is right here.
Just follow your script.
Follow the script? Do you know who I am? Okay, fine. Okay, so apparently I'm required by my contract to follow the script. Alright, and who wrote this? Economics. Okay, fine, let's go. In its essence, the Cold War was the period between 1945 and 1989 of ideological conflict between the newly established world powers post-World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, each of these superpowers had very clear beliefs and intended to make Europe great again. Yet, each one of them regarded a different set of political and ideological beliefs. Capitalism versus communism, Truman versus Stalin, workers versus Kepto, vodka versus cola. Nonetheless, it is impossible to evaluate such an event without first taking into consideration the natural resources and industrial development that led the US and the USSR to the high standing they enjoyed during the Cold War. Their success is closely related to the abundance of natural resources that both countries possessed, and still do, in their respective territories. I mean, look at the size of this thing. Following the natural progression of any society, a surplus of resources meant the development of new or already existing industries, along with urbanization. I cannot stress enough how important this is. Look, imagine what happens when you have the most intelligent minds in both countries with seemingly unlimited assets. Technology and weapon manufacturing go off the charts, which is similar to what happened in the space race. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
The more you look at movies that were released during the Cold War, the more you realize they were more propaganda than, well, actual movies. Films like these include classics like James Bond, which show the British perspective in the Cold War as this chilled old dude who is more rational than all the other powers combined and keeps them from killing each other. However, there is one movie that I'm going to talk about today, and one that shines above all others in terms of over-the-top propaganda, with one simple message: we Americans are so jaw-droppingly awesome, even the commies want us to win. That's right, you know it, you love it, it's Rocky IV, and it's Fist of Freedom in all its American propagandistic glory. Well, as much as I talk about that, Rocky IV is, however, still a prime example of how the Cold War affected entertainment and popular culture, and this is seen primarily in the design of the movie's main antagonist, Ivan Drago. He is a steroid-infused giant with no regard for human life whatsoever, and whose training involves specifically designed exercising equipment to maximize his physical prowess, which reflects the perspective of how Americans view the communist Russia. Rocky can be seen as a...
Nico, come on, brother! Don't leave me here! Nico! I know you're there!
Rocky can also be seen as a representation of how the Americans thought of themselves, showing us how he imitates Drago's training regime by only using cheap household items like the sleigh and an axe, and wins through sheer willpower, showing the idea of the super-powered underdog that the Americans had of themselves. If you think about it, however, this movie could just as easily be in Soviet propaganda if you interpret it by another angle. Rocky would have probably been viewed as an incontrollable, cocky brownhead who bullies his wife and children, one step clear defeat, and only fights for himself. All of these he actually does in the movie. While Drago could be seen as what happens when a great physical strength is properly guided by a scientific and intellectual mind and is fighting for a higher cause like the glory of his country, which he actually does until the end of the movie.
So you might think that video games used to be really innocent back in the day, and that only in the last couple generations the entertainment industry just gave up on trying. When in fact, there were some pretty aggressive platforms running in the mid and late 1980s. Some might argue that most of this content was motivated by marketing, but after some research, it wasn't difficult to identify a common thread going on. Many games released at that era were in fact shaped by the Cold War. Super Punch-Out and B-1 Nuclear Bomber are only a few of the many cases out there. But for the purposes of this video, I'm only gonna be analyzing Raid Over Moscow and the beloved Tetris. Now, it is no surprise that during the Cold War, the entertainment industry was almost entirely polarized by the blue and red nations. Yet, up to 1984, there was never such an obvious example shouting at your face and stealing your marquees. Raid Over Moscow was developed by Access Software, a US company, and until this date has been one of the most ridiculous propaganda against the Soviets. Look at this cover, they didn't even try to hide it, right up in your face! In the game, the player controls an American space pilot with the sole goal to prevent the launch of 3 Soviet nuclear missiles targeting North America, naturally. Okay, so as we know, the US and the USSR were in a constant technological race to prove who could create the most deadly and effective weapon that could eliminate the other. However, as we also know, they were in a constant tie. Thus, the campaign to destroy the Soviets' nuclear armory before they attacked, which was promoted by the game, not only was it realistic, but also one of the most aggressive forms of US propaganda caused by the Cold War. And then, there was Tetris. Tetris was a Soviet game created by Alexei Pajitnov in 1984. Originally, it was not meant to be a video game, but a software to test the capacity of the Electronica 60 at the computer center of the Academy of Science in Moscow. One day, a boy exported the game to an IBM PC, and from then on, the title began to spread over many districts in the Soviet Union until it eventually crossed the border to Hungary. There, it was discovered by Spectrum Holobyte, who ultimately bought the rights to the Amiga version. The Holobyte adaptation of the game carried heavy Soviet imagery, such as a picture of the St. Basil's Cathedral and the title screen, as well as the use of the Russian alphabet in the title itself. Naturally, when the game was marketed in the US, most Soviet symbolism had to be removed, with only a small remark in the box that read, "From Russia with fun." Now listen, imagine almost 40 consecutive years of secrets and tensions between two nations. Nothing from the US was marketed or sold in the USSR and vice versa. From food to technology, nothing crossed their borders. With time, this idea turned into a taboo, and eventually it was broken by the most unlikely of projects. That's right, the 4 square scythe and hammer, baby. Tetris represented the first exchange, if you will, of technologies between the Soviets and the US in a long time. And because of that, I can affirm with 100%, 50% certainty that Tetris indeed ended the Cold War. Finally, in this case, the restrictions in trade implied by the Cold War, in fact, made the public more interested in what was being prohibited. And in turn, when such product actually made it to the US from the USSR, one of the most vital foundations of the conflict was being defied.
Sports. Where do I even start? Sports have always been one of the best ways to entertain a bunch of people dating back to even the medieval times. However, during the Cold War, it became very common for people to watch sports live on their television. One of these events were the Rumble in the Jungle, a boxing event that was held in the Congo, the heavyweight champion George Foreman against the challenger Muhammad Ali. Let's think of sports like this. War. Except no one dies. It had always been the US versus the Soviet Union. The biggest fuss and fuss was always made when the USSR went against the US in either ice hockey, boxing, or any event in the Olympics. The Summer and Winter Olympics during the Cold War was hectic and probably one of the most interesting sports events that happened in the mid-late 90s. This is because politics were so involved in the Olympics that if you ever had a dream of representing your country, then just don't get your hopes up, because it's all about whether or not your president is in the right mood to spend his money on taking you. During the Winter Olympics of 1980, there was this great event called Miracle on Ice. This was one of the biggest ice hockey games ever between the US and USSR, fighting for first place when a bunch of college students beat the Soviet Union's legendary hockey team in the last few seconds. The USSR did not accept their second place medals at all, which is kind of funny because a few Winter Olympics back, the US didn't accept their second place engraved medals either. And as that Winter Olympics came to an end, the planning for the Summer Olympics started to take place. And in that very moment, the Soviet Union was invading Afghanistan, which the US didn't like at all, and so they told the Soviet Union, hey, if you don't tell your soldiers to retreat and get out of Afghanistan, we will boycott the Summer Olympics. And of course, the Soviet Union did nothing about it, which ended up making over 75% of capitalist countries boycotting the next Summer Olympics, making it one of the smallest Olympics since 1956. Therefore, the Cold War affected sports in such a way for society to rather compare their military strength against the other countries, because there was always tension, always the threat of nuclear war breaking out. Instead of people and family just watching for their favorite team winning, they witnessed a battle between their allies and their enemy.
So, as you can see, maybe for the people in the political aspects of this conflict, this was a deadly rivalry which threatened the extinction of humanity. But for the people who sell things, this was just a new marketing gimmick. Putting the communism versus capitalism conflict to appeal an audience in sports, movies, and video games was just a way to sell by making people feel like they were watching something important, something that would change the course of history. People who consumed this media felt the need to be part of a group that was bigger than themselves, to join a side that they considered to be righteous and show it off to everybody like it's their new gluten-free diet. Not judging, just saying it's an important life change. And if it weren't for media like Tetris, which was made by one side but still loved by both, this us versus them mentality might have carried on until today, at a greater scale than now, of course. So thanks to Tetris breaking the standard ideology of us versus them marketing and allowing people from both sides to experience their innovations, the Cold War ended. Looking back, you might think that the manipulation of masses suffered due to the aggressive entertainment propaganda from the US and USSR were self-evident and could have been easily avoided. But take a moment and think about your life. Consider all the pretty colors and packages that stimulate your brain. You will realize inevitably that propaganda is really an important part of your routine, and that it subtly turns the views of others into your own.
Tetris ended the Cold War. It totally wasn't the fall of the great